Today, we'll be deploying this application built with MongoDB, Express, Vue, and Node.js onto a virtual private server and configuring it to be accessible at mooncoins.net. Hey team, Sid here with DevOps Directive, where it's my job to help you level up your DevOps and cloud infrastructure skills. If you're new here, consider subscribing, and if you get value from this video, hit the like button so that I know and I'll make more videos like this in the future. This video is actually a collaboration with Gary Simon of the Design Course YouTube channel. Gary handles the design and development portions of the build, and then I take over to deploy it. If you're interested in the upfront design and development, I'll link to the full video hosted on Gary's channel. And then this video will be focused on the deployment piece. My approach in this video is a little different than my other videos. Rather than using something like Docker and setting up a bunch of automation, I'll do it the hard way this time. By that, I mean I'll go through each step in the process manually, explaining every step along the way. There's 5 main things that I'm going to do in this process. First, I'm going to make a few minor modifications to the code that Gary wrote to make it ready for deployment. Next, I'll make some configurations within the GUI on hostinger.com to set up the VPS so that I'll be able to connect to it, and then configure DNS to point our domain to the IP address. I'll install and configure MongoDB on the server. I'll install Caddy server, which is going to serve the front-end files and proxy to the backend API. And then I'll also install Node.js, a Node.js package called PM2, which is a process manager that we'll use to manage our backend service. With that, let's get into it. Gary just pushed the latest version of his code to GitHub, so I'm going to go ahead and clone that to my local system. I'll just copy this URL here, then do git clone, paste that in. Now I can change directory into that directory, mooncoins, and then I'll open up my code editor. As I said, there's a couple of minor changes that I want to make here. The first of which is to modify some hard-coded strings to make them more generic so that they'll work for both our local environment as well as the production deployed environment. Within this app.vue file, we've got a hard-coded localhost 4000 here on line 38. I'm going to change that to use an environment variable with process.env, and then it has to have this prefix of vue app. Then we can name it whatever we want. So I'll do base API URL. And it has to have this prefix because that'll get picked up when we actually run our Yarn build process. Now I'll store the values that'll get substituted in there in 2 different files. The first file is going to be .env.development. And this will get used when we run our yarn start command, or yarn serve command, excuse me. So we need to define that same environment variable name, which is vue app base API URL, vue app base API URL, and then we'll set it equal to that value. So now when we run this locally, it'll behave as expected. Next, we'll create another file, .env.production, and this file will get used when we run yarn build. We'll paste in that same string, but instead of setting it to that localhost value, we'll set it to mooncoins.net. We can remove the port number. This way, when it's deployed into Hostinger and we make an API request, it'll request this URL rather than localhost, which is important so that we have the request coming from the same origin as the front end and the back end. That handles the changes for the front end. There is an additional change on the back end that we'll need to make. Within this database.js file, we've got a connection string hard-coded here. So again, I'm going to remove that and set it equal to this process.env, and I'll call it Mongo connection URI. Great. Now, in order for this to keep running locally, I'm going to add to our package.json file, start here, and that start command is going to set that environment variable before it runs Node and then app.js. So we'll do Mongo connection string, connection URI, excuse me, equals, set it equal to that value, and then we'll run Node app.js. So now if we were to run yarn start, it would execute this and set that environment variable, which would get picked up by this process environment here. When we deploy it onto the hosting or virtual server, we'll set this to a different value with some actual authentication for our MongoDB database. That's all I need to do to change the code. Now I'm going to jump into the hosting or interface and make a few setting changes there. The first thing I'll do is create a DNS record pointing this mooncoins.net to the IP address of our server. So I've already copied the value of that IP address. I'll just go in here under Manage, DNS name servers, and then I'll add an A-type record with the @ symbol. The @ symbol just denotes that it's the root URL. So this will point mooncoins.net to this IP address. We'll add that record, and then we see it shown up here at the bottom. There's lots of these other records that I think hosting are added automatically. Those are less important. As long as we have this one, we should be good to go. Now I'll go back to the server interface, and I need to configure a way to connect to this server. There's a few different options. I could set the root password here and then log in with that. It's easier and more secure to use an SSH key. I already have one set up. If you need to learn how to do it, they have a tutorial here linked, but I'm just going to cat my public key out and then copy it into this input box. So it'll be cat, and then my home directory, .ssh, id.pub. And so this is the public key that I can paste in there to verify my private key on that server. So I'll paste this in, click add. Looks like it's being added. It could take a minute to connect, but now I should be able to just run this SSH root command and get connected to that server. I'll add the fingerprint to my known hosts, and now we're connected. Awesome. The next step, as I mentioned, is going to be to install MongoDB onto this server. I'm just going to follow this Community Edition on Ubuntu tutorial for 20.04, which is the version of Ubuntu that I'm running. The first thing that we're going to do is to grab the GPG key from the MongoDB servers so that we can verify that it has the correct signature when we download the package. Looks like that worked. Now we need to create a list file so that it can look up the sources for where it's going to download this from. We'll run an apt-get update. And while these have sudo associated with them, I'm logged in as a root user, so you don't actually need to have sudo here if you do it this way. Now I can install, using apt-get install, MongoDB org. This is the Community Edition. Now while that's installing, I'll point out this next session. If we didn't do anything else, the next time we did an apt-get update, or upgrade, it would actually upgrade the version of MongoDB, which could be an issue if they were breaking changes. Instead, we can run these commands, and that will pin the version to the current version that's being installed so that we don't run into that issue down the road. So now that that is finished installing, I'll go ahead and run that. Okay, good. And now we're going to use systemctl to actually control MongoDB, and this way we can set it up so that it will run. If it crashes, it will restart, and when we restart the server, we can configure MongoDB to start up automatically. So I'll run systemctl start mongo. We can then check the status of it with this command, and we can see that it's running. Awesome. Finally, I'll run system-control enable Mongo, and this will set it up so that when the system starts up, Mongo will start along with it. Great, so now we have MongoDB installed, but it's important to note that by default, MongoDB doesn't actually have any access control, and any user can do anything. So we'll want to add some user accounts with more limited access so that we can control which data users can actually see within the database. This is a good tutorial on the official MongoDB documentation on how to do that. The first thing that we're going to do is just connect into the database with the command mongo. This will bring up a command prompt running inside the database. We're going to use the admin database, so we'll switch to dbadmin, and then we're going to create a user. So the first user that I'm going to create will be called myUserAdmin. It's going to have this role user admin any database. So this user will be able to do pretty much anything. Finally, it's going to also have read write any database. So it can read and write from not just the admin, but any database across the whole install. It then prompts me to input a password, so I'll do that. Great, so it looks like that added successfully. While we could use this user, I'm actually going to create another user with less permissions to use for the actual application. So again, it'll be db create user. This one I'm going to name non-admin user. So here, the name of the user is non-admin user, and it only has this read-write role specifically for the Mooncoins database, and that's the database that we're going to store the data for the application. Again, I input a password, and it looks like it was created successfully. Finally, before I exit out, I'm going to use Mooncoins. This will switch to the Mooncoins database, or if it hasn't been created, it will create that database and then switch to it. So that's all I need to do right now within the database itself, so I can exit. However, I do need to now restart MongoDB to pick up those changes. So first, I'll stop it with systemctl stop MongoD. And now I'm going to modify the configuration file that MongoDB uses upon load using this command. So I'll open it in vi/etc MongoDB conf. And we want to update the security section. It's going to be security. And then we want to specify authorization enabled. Authorization enabled. We'll just save that. And then we can just restart MongoDB. Check that it's running. And it looks like we're good to go. So we now should have those two users that we created, one admin user, one non-admin user with passwords, and we're going to be able to use that within our application configuration to connect to the database. Next up, I want to actually copy our application code onto the server. There's a few ways we could get the code onto the server. I could copy it from my local machine onto it, which is the method I'm going to use. I could also pull it from GitHub if I wanted to. If we were going to automate this, likely we would have some CI continuous integration tool that would push changes with each commit to the master branch or the main branch onto our server, and then we'd be able to build from there. But for now, I'm just going to manually copy it from the local system. So I'll exit off of this SSH session, and then I'm going to rsync the code from my local directory onto the remote directory. So the command for that will be rsync -r for recursive. I don't want to copy in the node modules folder because they could be slightly different from my Mac onto this Linux machine. And so I'll exclude, and I'll use the asterisk as a wildcard, so it'll catch both the front end and the back end npm modules folders. And now we want to copy from my current working directory, present working directory, where the source code is, onto this VM at the IP address. And then on that machine, I'm just going to use the standard convention of user source app. Okay, it looks like that worked. So now I'll SSH back into that machine and just verify that that code is actually there. So I'll change directory into this folder. If I list the files, now all of the code is onto the server. Perfect. With that done, I'm going to go ahead and start to install the different dependencies for these. By default, Yarn is not installed in Ubuntu, so I'm going to have to go ahead and install Yarn. It's similar to installing Mongo. We're going to add a GPG key. Okay, then we're going to add the sources list file. We'll apt update. And then with that complete, we'll just apt install yarn. Awesome. Looks like it's done. So now I can just do yarn install. I'm inside of this top level directory. And so if I do yarn install, it'll install all the dependencies in that package.json file. Yarn install. Great. With our dependencies installed, we can now build the application with yarn build. As I mentioned earlier, using yarn build will set it into production mode, so we'll use that .env.production file and pick up the correct base API route so that when we deploy it, it will have the same origin as the front end. It looks like it was successful. If I list the files in dist, I can see all the files that were built, including the index.html as well as some JavaScript. Now I need to install Caddy, which is the web server that we're going to use to serve the front end as well as proxy to the back end. When I first tried to set this up, it wouldn't start and I couldn't figure out why. But then I looked at what was already running and I noticed that there was an instance of Apache running. So if I do top, I can see all the processes running on the system, and I see Apache 2 here running. It was binding to port 80, and so I actually need to stop that before I can spin up Caddy. In order to do that, I'll just run the command /etc initd Apache 2 stop. This way, port 80 will be free and we can install and run Caddy on it. Again, installing Caddy is similar to installing these other packages. We start by setting up the GPG key. We then add the lists file. We'll run apt update. And then finally, we can install Caddy. Now by default, Ubuntu will only serve files within the /var www HTML directory. So we're going to need to move our built front end into that directory. The way that we can do that is with the cp or copy command. We'll copy recursively with -r, and then we'll copy from user source app dist, which is where those built files are stored, into var HTML, www HTML. We'll also want to configure the firewall so that inbound traffic can access our files via Caddy. In order to do that, I'm going to install UFW, Ubuntu Firewall. I'll then configure a few rules. We can do UFW allow HTTP. This will allow inbound traffic on port 80. We'll also do HTTPS, which will allow inbound traffic on port 443. And finally, we'll set allow SSH so that we'll still be able to connect via SSH. At this point, we need to enable the firewall. So we do UFW enable. Yes. Now the firewall is active with those rules applied. To configure Caddy, we use a Caddyfile located in /etc caddy Caddyfile. So I'll edit that file now. Here's the default. We're going to make a few modifications to it. The first thing that we need to do is replace this port 80 with our domain name. So in this case, it will be mooncoins.net. We then need to specify the email address associated with that domain in order for the authentication challenge to generate the certificate to succeed. This is contact@corsetro.com. We need to set the root directory equal to where the website files are stored, so I just copied them there. It's that var www HTML directory. And then we're going to add one more directive here, the reverse proxy directive. And so what this is going to do is allow us to catch any requests to mooncoins.net/API by doing this /API star. So this will catch any request that is mooncoins.net/API and then any trailing characters. And then we're actually going to redirect that request to localhost 4000, which is where we're going to serve the backend service. File server is correct. And so now we'll just exit out of this. And we want to actually restart Caddy to pick up these changes. So I'll use systemctl, restart Caddy. So that should pick up the changes. And then I'll also do systemctl enable Caddy so that it would be run upon startup for the virtual server. At this point, we should be able to access the front end on our domain. If I go to mooncoins.net, I can see that it loads properly. However, we don't have the back end running yet. So if I try to add one, btc add, nothing happens. That's expected because our backend's not actually running. So that takes us to the final portion of this. We need to actually activate that back end. And as I mentioned, we're going to use a tool called PM2, which is an NPM package that manages processes so that we could have multiple instances of our app with the load balancer in front. If the process dies, it will restart it automatically. So it's much better than just running it with Node and then app.js. So in order to install this, I'm going to install it globally with npm install pm2-g. Oh, I don't have npm. Yarn global add pm2. I'll cd into my backend directory. Now, like the front end, we need to install the dependencies for the backend. So we'll do yarn install. And we'll grab all those dependencies from package.json and install them. Great. One additional consideration is that if I just ran it as is, it would run as the root user. Preferably, we don't want our processes running as root, and so instead, I'm going to create a dedicated Node user that will run to use this. In order to do that, I'll do the add user and then name it Node. It's going to ask me for a new password, which I'll give it. Again, none of these values matter. And so now we have a new user named Node. In order to set PM2 up to be able to handle modifying the startup scripts, I do need to allow Node to elevate itself to user with the proper password. So to do that, I'll run user mod -a capital G sudo node. So this adds the Node user to the sudo user group so that it can elevate its privileges as necessary. In order to use this Node user, I'll now use su, which will permanently allow me to start a session as that user, and then, not node 3, just node. So now we have a session running as that Node user, and we can use this to spin up our process. As I mentioned, we want to set up PM2 so that it will start our process upon startup. So I'll set PM2 startup, and here it notes because I'm not running as root, it gives me this specific command that I can execute to set up the startup script appropriately. It asks for my password to elevate the privileges. And now it should be configured in systemd to run upon startup. At this point, we're ready to actually spawn the backend app. Similar to when I ran it locally with yarn serve, I need to specify that environment variable. Mongo connection URI. And that's going to be equal to MongoDB : // and then it's going to be the username, so that's non-admin user, colon, and then the password at localhost 27017 is the port, /mooncoins is the database, and then we need to specify the auth source equals admin. So this, remember when we created that user, we created it within that admin database. So by setting auth source equals admin, it will know to use the admin database to look up our user and figure out which roles it should have. Now we'll specify pm2 start and then the path to our app.js file. So it'll be user source app backend app.js. That's going to spawn our process, and now we can see it running. Finally, I'll do pm2 save, which will take the current set of applications running, and pm2 save, which will take the current set of applications running and store them into that startup configuration. So if I go back to here and I try to add this new coin, BTC, and hit return, it adds it to our list, and that gets stored in the database. Awesome. Let's add another one, ETH, Litecoin. We can try deleting one, adding it back. Okay, it seems like things are working. Let me refresh the page. We see that the data is still stored. Also, because I set up that reverse proxy, if I go to mooncoins.net/API, we can hit the API directly and see the response returned in JSON. And that's it. We have the application running on a virtual private server and connected to our custom domain. Hopefully this video was helpful in learning about all the different steps that go into deploying an application. If you want to learn how to use something like Docker or GitHub Actions to automate this type of thing, feel free to check out one of these other videos on my channel over there. That's it for today. Remember, just keep building.